Well, thank you for joining me on a very unique and very interesting YouTube subject. Very strange secrets of U.S. presidents. Growing up in school, I never heard any of this taught. When I say growing up, I'm talking about back in the 1960s and the 70s. You never heard this. But these are some of the most unusual things about U.S. presidents that people did not know. And the last thing I'm going to share with you is the most bizarre and the most interesting. So watch the entire video because I think you'll find it very intriguing. Let's look at some U.S. presidents and some very strange facts about them. First of all, George Washington had a mouthful of dentures. All of his teeth in his mouth were actually dentures. And he was concerned about his horse's teeth. So his horse that he rode on, he had the horse's teeth brushed every single day. I'm assuming so the horse would not have a bad tooth that would have to be removed or lose a tooth. That's very interesting. John Quincy Adams read the Bible through every year from cover to cover, a U.S. president. Andrew Jackson cursed so much that his parrot used horrible profanity, and at his funeral, the parrot had to be removed from the area of the funeral because of the amount of profanity the parrot was speaking. Zachary Taylor never voted in a presidential election in his entire life, and yet he was elected president by the American people. Andrew Johnson never attended one single day of school, and yet he became president. James Garfield was shot, and the doctors tried 4 times to remove the bullet, and they failed, and that's what actually killed him. Theodore Roosevelt loved hunting, and 4 mountain lions attacked his dog, and he became so angry he took a knife and killed all 4 mountain lions. Sounds like something David would do in the Old Testament with a bear and a lion. Franklin Roosevelt, when he would go on vacation, his wife would mail their dog postcards. And Richard Nixon, his mom wanted him to be a Quaker missionary. Can you imagine that? And he wanted a job in the FBI, but he was turned down. Now, one of the most interesting concepts of an historical fact concerning U.S. presidents is something that I did teach over the years from time to time. And it begins with a president by the name of Harrison. In fact, this began after 3 U.S. presidents died on the 4th of July. And 2 of them actually died the same day on the 4th of July, but there were 3 that died on the 4th of July, which was America's Day of Independence. It started after that. Now, there was a man by the name of Harrison who became very popular back in his day in the 1800s as someone who attacked the Indian tribes. And I'm going to use, we today respectfully call our native friends First Nations people, but back in that day, they were called Indians. Now, during Harrison's time, the Shawnees had a chief that was also known as a prophet, the Shawnee Indians. And he had a brother by the name of Tecumseh, and they were both leaders in their tribe, and the United States government wanted to take their land from them. So Harrison, because the natives refused to do that, to give up the land, Harrison moved in with 1,000 soldiers and literally slaughtered so many of the Shawnee tribe. Now, there was a legend that developed out of this, and I'm going to read a quote to you. By the time Harrison had arrived on the scene, most of the Indians had been reduced to poverty. Their hunting lands had already been carved up by the new farmers in the midst of them and regularly vandalized by traders. Harrison added more than 50 million acres to public government lands. The Indians weren't paid, of course, but the official government price to the white settlers were $2 an acre. After the Battle of Tippecanoe, this was a battle that Harrison was involved in. Later in the 1830s, Shawnee chief Tecumseh sent a message to Harrison by a released prisoner, and this was the quote: "Harrison will not win this year to be the great chief," meaning the leader of America. "If he wins, he will die in office. Every 20 years, the leader will die to remember the death of my people." So this was the story that got out, that the Indian prophet of the Shawnee Indians placed a curse on the American leader. They called him the great chief. We would know that person is the president. That every 20 years, whoever sat in the office of the great chief or the president would die in office. to remember what they did to the Indian people. Now, let's go through this list very quickly. In 1840, Harrison was elected. On Inauguration Day, he caught a cold and died 30 days later. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected, and he had a very strange dream. In fact, two different dreams that he was going to die, and he did, and he was shot to death in Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. 20 years later, in 1880, James Garfield was elected, and he was in office for 3 months, but he was shot by an assassin at a train station in Washington, D.C. 20 years later, in 1900, William McKinley was elected, and at the Pan American Expo in New York, while shaking hands, he was shot and died of gangrene. William Harding was elected 20 years later in 1920, and in 1923, during a speaking tour, he became violently ill and he passed away. In 1940, Roosevelt was elected, but however, Roosevelt served 4 terms, and Roosevelt eventually died. And someone said, okay, in 1940, what if Wendell Willkie would have been elected instead of Roosevelt? Would he have made it through this alleged curse? And the answer is no, because William Willkie, who ran against Roosevelt, he also died in 1944. It's very bizarre. 20 years later, John F. Kennedy was elected president. Now, Gordon Lindsay of Christ for the Nations wrote a book on the zero curse, and he wrote it about the time that Kennedy was going to be elected president, and Kennedy was elected president in 1960. And he noted that according to this alleged curse, that whoever would be elected in 1960 would die in office. And of course, that did happen when Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, November of 1963, at the, we assume, of course, from the research that Lee Harvey Oswald shot President Kennedy. In 1980, now this would be the 8th president, Kennedy was the 7th president in order that died in office every 20 years. Now, when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, I knew about this alleged curse that was placed upon the presidents. And I had some friends of mine, and because I don't have their permission to use their name, I'll not use their name, but they said to me that they had access to the White House when Reagan was president, and that Reagan was informed about this zero curse, and several ministers went to the White House under Reagan to break this zero curse off of President Ronald Reagan, who was actually a devout Christian. You know, and I know, if you'll remember, that in March of 1981, a man by the name of Hinckley, right outside a hotel where Reagan was speaking, made an attempt on Reagan's life. The bullet, according to a Secret Service agent that I personally know that was in the agency at that time, the bullet ricocheted off of the door of the limousine, but it did go into Reagan's chest about an inch from his heart. But Reagan was spared, and this friend of mine who had access to the White House said to me that we believe it was because, and Reagan believed it was because, that something had been broken spiritually through the power of prayer to break the zero curse. Now, it is interesting that if you'll research the 7 presidents who were either killed in office or died in office with different circumstances, all of them happened to be born in states that took a lot of property from the native people, that took a lot of property from what they called in that day the Indian tribes or the Indian people, and ran them off of the land. Now, that's a very interesting note. So it stopped at the end of the 7th president, who was John F. Kennedy. One of the interesting verses, and we're not going to try to connect this way as a definite part of this verse, we're only pointing this out as a point of interest, that the Lord said that if a nation or the leadership of Israel would abide in iniquity, that they would be punished 7 times. And 4 times in one chapter in the book of Leviticus, it mentions 7-time punishment. So could it be that this curse had some kind of an impact because of the treatment of the First Nations people? And I guess we would have to say only the Lord knows. I do think it's a very weird coincidence that some would suggest that every 20 years when a president was elected, they died in office based on the legend of the curse of the Shawnee prophet putting it on the leader of the United States. And these are just some of the very interesting facts that you can encounter when you study U.S. history. I'm a history buff. I love American history. I love Israeli history, ancient history as well. And so most of you know that if you've heard us teach. I want you to subscribe to our channel if you have not done so. Give this a thumbs up if you think it's an interesting teaching. Please do that right now. You can click right now that thumbs up. And also stay tuned and keep watching, because we always make something very special available through our